sermon is Hope Springs Eternal. It's an optimistic sermon, or a sermon for an optimist, and also a Father's Day sermon. And the reason I say that is because this was Solomon writing to his son. There's a book called The Boy Crisis, and it tells about how important it is to have a man, a father, in the home. Children, by the age of 9.5, will have their telomeres shortened if a father is not present. Now, you wonder, what's a telomere? Well, a man has an X and a Y chromosome. All your body's made of X and Y chromosomes, and a woman's is made up of X chromosomes. The point is, your chromosome has some things at the end that's called telomeres that protect the end from fraying or tangling. And the reason they're important is it's a predictor of how long your life will be and how old you'll grow and if you'll have diseases and cancer. And if there's no father in the house, a girl at 9.5 will have 14% shorter telomeres, and a boy will have 56% shorter telomeres. All of that just because there's no father in the house. A boy without a father will often find one when he becomes a teen. And sadly, it'll usually be the worst kids in the neighborhood, or if he's in a larger community, it'll be a gang or some radical group. The author of this book told this story of how he got in a letter. This young boy, actually, as a teen, had said, my mother didn't like, I had no father figure because my mother didn't like my father, and then I went to live with my aunt, and she didn't like men either, and so his father figure became a radical fascist group, and he wrote a 50-page manifesto where he was going to publish when he committed some great atrocity, like a school shooting. And then he read the book, Boy Crisis, and it turned him around. He now understood why he was thinking the way he did, and the answers changed his life. Now, this is a nice book, a good book, an important book, but it's nowhere near as important as the Bible. And that's why the Bible needs to be front and center, even in the educational system, because it answers things in your life. Even if you're not going to become a Christian, you better understand life and relationships and right from wrong. There's a saying, it's not a very wise one, that says, a woman needs a man like a fish needs a bicycle. Well, you understand a fish doesn't need a bicycle, but obviously God created a family, ideally, to have one man, one woman, and children. It's so fundamental that the end of your chromosomes will not develop properly if your family is made up in a different way. I tell this story, a chromosome story, not because it's the only one, but there's many other stories that you could tell that prove that God is worthy of listening to when he speaks. The room should go quiet, and people who have a pen should write it down quickly so they can memorize it later. This is not, now, I told you this was also an optimist servant, and you've heard that expression. There's some people that say that the cup is half empty, and some that say it's half full. Well, somebody that's saying it's half full is not saying it's 100% full. They're saying, I like to see it as filling up. I'm an optimist. I want it to be better. Optimistic people want to believe the best. And this is one of those cases. The dad, Solomon, wanted his son to have this good information that he put together in Proverbs and other places, and especially right here. He wanted him to have it, to help him live better. And it was real important because not only did he have to live better for himself, but he was king. And if he lived badly, so went his country. So he wanted to make sure that he was going to help his son do a better job. So let's look at these words written by Solomon late in his life. And as I say, I'm an optimist, and I look at this and I say, I think Solomon turned his life around at the end, and he wrote Ecclesiastes to say, this is the right way to go, even if I didn't do it for a while. Number one is separate the task from the person. Verse 9 and 10 says, in addition to being a wise man, the preacher also taught the people knowledge, and he prospered. He pondered, searching out and arranging many proverbs. The preacher sought to find delightful words and to write them down truthfully. Now, as a part of my training at Apex was how to get along with other employees. It was a management course, and I didn't take many of them, but this one particular one told you to separate the task from the person. So the task of the person was driving the forklift. But if he did it badly and ran into something and smashed something, you didn't hate him. You just said, you did your job poorly. It doesn't make you a bad person. I watched the video. You know what chlorine is. Chlorine is what they made mustard gas with in the First World War. And this crane operator is lifting 40-foot containers full of chlorine off a wharf onto the back of the ship. 1, 2, 3, number 6, fell and burst. And there's just this cloud of mustardy colored stuff everywhere, just expanding, ever expanding. And you can watch the video of people running to get away from it, and you can't hate the forklift, the crane operator. There's 100 reasons it could have happened. It may have been a cable broke. It may have been all sorts of things. You have to separate what he was doing from him. He's not a villain. It's a terrible mistake happened. Well, there's lots of times that works perfectly, separate. But there's one time where you can't separate the person from his task. Well, that job was picked out by Jesus. He did this. He said, here's what you need to do. When soldiers came to become a Christian, to be baptized, Jesus gave them a few instructions. But when the chief priests and the Pharisees came, he called them whitewashed sepulchres, because what they did and who they were inseparable. They weren't supposed to be divided. You weren't supposed to take the task apart. Their life and actions had to line up because they were teaching the way to live, and if they didn't live that way, it looked like bad advice. There's you know how there's a job that's supposed to be done and you can't separate? They did an experiment in France 150 years ago. They said, why does a woman have to love her child? Why can't she just look after it? And so they took 50 children from an orphanage, and they fed them, and they washed them, and they clothed them, and they didn't show them any love or affection. All 50 babies died. That's how important it is to love and affection from a mother and father is so important. It has to be that part of that child's life where it's more than likely that they're going to be broken as they grow up. The same is true for a Christian and for this teacher, Solomon. He had to be a proper worshiper of God, or he would fail at the job of being a preacher. It's why people are so free to call out Christians when their actions don't meet that picture in the person's head of what the person's, you're a Christian, this is how you're supposed to behave. The preacher in this case was Solomon, and the Bible says in his later life he did wrong. And I thought to myself, I wonder if there was a period, like you take all this information about Solomon, you say that he wrote 1,000 psalms and hymns and songs, and he gathered all these proverbs. And I wonder if later in life, when he stopped, he did wrong, he stopped doing that. Well, he also said that you can't, your relationship with God is affected with everything you do. And if it's bad, your actions, while couched in Christian words, will still be bad. And Jesus called the Pharisees out in this all the time. Number 2, all things have a limit. In verse 11 and 12 it said, the words of a wise man are like gourds, and the masters of these collections are like well-driven nails. They are given by one shepherd. But beyond this, my son, be warned, the writing of many books is endless, and exceeding devotion to books is wearisome to the body. Now, Solomon understood the value of wisdom and wise sayings, and how they could be useful and timeless. I was reading, people put things on Facebook, and I was reading this on Facebook, and it talked about how it was important that the government got voting and things right. And you said, okay, that seems up to date and like current, and because of all the stuff going on in the U.S. and talking about voter fraud. And then you read down through in the bottom, this saying was written by Socrates 2,300 years ago. You think, well, so it's a timeless saying. You got to get stuff right. Well, all wise sayings that are he gathered are valuable and important, but they all have their exceptions and their limits. More than that, there's a time that you have to say, I'm putting this, I'm stopping this. An example was I used to read a lot about creation science. I read all sorts of stuff, and eventually I said, look, I'm convinced that God created the heavens and the earth. I don't need to read more. It's not going to change, it's going to only change a little bit. Well, here's what my father said. This is, father saying, he is a churchgoer. He went to lots of church conferences, things, and he said, you know, it's time people stop going to church conferences and started using the things they learned from the last dozen they went to. You can learn a lot of stuff, but if you never use it, it's like I'm an electrician. I learned all that electrician stuff, but I've never practiced it at all. That may be okay, but if you're a Christian, the stuff you learn needs to be put into practice. Well, number 3 is, when everything has been heard, verse 13 to 14, the conclusion, when all has been heard, is to fear God and keep his commandments, because this applies to every person. For God will bring every act to judgment, everything which is hidden, whether it is good or evil. Solomon gave this last statement to his son, and he said, look, just because you're the king doesn't mean this applies differently to you than it applies to your lowest subject. Everybody, whether you're wise or uneducated, comes to the same place. They both have to fear God and keep his commandments. This is a book called The Chronicles of Narnia, C.S. Lewis. It's actually 7 books, but this is a fat one. But in the book, The Voyage of the Dawn Treader, there's talking about King Caspian, and he wanted to abandon his responsibilities. He's come to something out there is just amazing, and he wants to give up all the stuff to follow this. And so he's telling us, and it says, but sir, interrupted Darian. Are you abdicating? I'm going with Reepicheep to see World's End, said Caspian. A low murmur of dismay ran through the sailors. We will take the boat, says Caspian. There's no need of it. In these gentle seas, you must build a new one on Ramadua Island. And now, Caspian, said Edmund, suddenly and sternly, you cannot do this. Most certainly, said Reepicheep. His Majesty cannot. No, indeed, said Darian. Can't, said Caspian sharply, looking for a moment not unlike his uncle Miraz. Begging your Majesty's pardon, said Renal from the deck below, but if one of us did the same, it would be called deserting. You presume too much on your long service, Renal, said Caspian. No, sir, he's perfectly right, said Darian. By the name of Aslan, said Caspian, I thought that you were all my subjects here and not my schoolmasters. I'm not, said Edmund, and I say that you cannot do this. Cannot again, said Caspian, what do you mean? If it pleases your Majesty, we mean shall not, said Reepicheep with a very low bow. You are king of Narnia. You break faith with all your subjects, and especially Tommelkin, if you do not return. You shall not please yourself with adventures if you're not, as if you were a private person. And if your Majesty will not hear reason, it will be the truest loyalty of every man on board to follow me in disarming you and binding you till you come to your senses. The point of this is that King Caspian had a duty to his subjects. He had to do something. It wasn't his right to do whatever he wanted to. The youngest son of, is it Edward? Who's the youngest son of the royalty? The ones that,
Queen.
yeah, not the Queen's son.
Harry?
Yeah, but anyway, the point is, they didn't want to do all the stuff that was necessary for, and they basically had to quit. The point is that they're not allowed to do this. They got a royal dressing down and said, you're going to be tied up. Solomon was saying the same thing to his child, who would be king after him. He had to answer to God the same as the lowest slave in his kingdom. They were all the servants of God. There was no escaping that he would judge everything and nothing would be hidden from it. The book of Ecclesiastes in this part at the end makes the cup half full part of me think that Solomon finally got it right. Those are important and good words at the end. In that he repented from his sins the same way his father David did. But it wasn't without consequences. Now, he had made mistakes and made temples for his wives, gods, and the damage was done. The kingdom would be split, and 10 tribes would start on a decline that would end with them being erased from history entirely. Lost to history, and lost the blessings of God's promise to his people. See, for a while, hopefully at the end he changed, but for a while, he was like King Caspian, except he did abandon his responsibilities and broke faith with his people. There's the Canadian poem, In Flanders Fields, reminds us that we're all responsible. We have a part that we can't abandon because it's hard and it requires a lot of us. This is the last verse. Take up our quarrel with the foe. To you from failing hands we throw. The torch be yours to hold it high. If ye break faith with us who die, we shall not sleep, though poppies grow in Flanders fields. If you break faith, there was a lot of breaking faith that Solomon wanted to make sure didn't happen. You think, how can the people of Canada stop turning away from God when we've embraced so much evil? And the answer is, just start and accept and rely on the mercy of Jesus. Solomon had told his son that he could not break faith with those he was king over, because he too answered to God. Well, there's an example of later kings of Israel, that one who broke faith and one who didn't. I'm going to read this in 2 Chronicles 28. 2 Chronicles 28 is Ezra, King Ezra. Now, it was a horrible example of him pulling the people to sacrifice other gods and moving farther and farther away. And then he got in trouble, and God sent people to attack him, and he lost, and he lost, and lost. And verse 28-22 says, "And at that time of his distress, the same King Ahaz became even more unfaithful to God. For he sacrificed to the gods of Damascus, which had defeated him, and said, Because the gods of the kings of Aram help them, I will sacrifice to them, that they may help me. But they became a downfall of him and all of Israel. Moreover, when Ahaz gathered together the utensils of the house of the Lord, he cut the utensils of the house of God in pieces, and closed the doors of the house of the Lord, and made altars for himself in every corner of Jerusalem. In every city of Judah he made high places to burn incense to other gods, and provoked the Lord, the God of his fathers, to anger." This is where he broke faith with his people. Well, his son, Hezekiah, when he became king, in the first 2 weeks, he made a decision that they were going to change. And he got the people to come and clean the temple out. And this is what it says in 30, verse 18. He had the people come, and he sent letters all over and said, "We're going to have the Passover." And in spite of the fact that the Passover was past, he said, "We're going to have it later." This is what it says. "For the multitude of people, even many from Ephraim and Manasseh and Issachar and Zebulun, had not purified themselves, yet they ate the Passover, otherwise than prescribed. For Hezekiah prayed for them, saying, May the good Lord pardon everyone who has prepared his heart to seek God, the Lord God of our fathers, though not according to the purification rules of the sanctuary." So God heard Hezekiah and healed the people. He did it all wrong, but he said, we so far away, we're going to try. And so they had it at the wrong time of the year, and the people weren't ready, but they still celebrated. Now, what's the conclusion? Well, Solomon was wise, and that didn't stop him from doing dumb things. We might ask, how is that possible? But asking that doesn't take into account the evidence before our own eyes. No one alive is as smart as Solomon, but there are lots of smart people around, and we watch them do dumb things every day. They should know better, but the secret ingredient is sin, and it fouls everything. And Solomon was included in this. But he wanted to do something special for his son. This is one of the Proverbs he gathered up and saved, and he should have read it himself after the fact. It says, Proverbs 16:12, "It is an abomination for kings to commit wicked acts, for the throne is established on righteousness." Well, he wanted his son to recognize that his godliness was as important as the godliness of the high priest. Because if he did something wrong and behaved badly, the kingdom would follow him. That's what happened to Ahaz. The kingdom followed Ahaz in all this worship of other gods. And then when Hezekiah followed God, the kingdom followed him too. Well, we as Christians are called to start well, but that's not enough. We also have to end well, and that's really hard. Solomon, at the end of his life, didn't end well. and it cost his kingdom a great deal. He broke faith with them, and as an old man, he was tired of fighting the good fight and gave in to the wives' nagging, and he built temples to other gods. The sin was all his, because it's wrong to expect sinners to behave like the saved people. He can't expect his wives pulled out of a culture who worshipped idols to want to give it up. And he broke faith with his wives too, because as the teacher, he didn't teach the commandments. His problem was his relationship was built on a broken commandment. And so what could he say to them? You must obey God, and they would answer to him, well, you don't. You know that you're not supposed to marry foreign women, but you have. You have 1,000 witnesses here that will say you got it wrong. Verse 10 says that preachers sought to find delightful words and write words of truth correctly. There's two reasons to do that. The first is because you love the Lord, and doing it honors him. The second is because you love words that go together nicely. Lots of people love Amazing Grace. The right way to love it is because you know that it reminds you of how bad sin is and how good a Savior we have. But some people love Amazing Grace because it's an almost perfect song. And people love perfect songs. You see the difference, don't you? You can enjoy the song but hate the one who it's sung about. It's written about. Well, what's to be done with this second kind of person who loves the song but doesn't love the Savior? The main thing to remember is that in all things God is faithful, even when we are not. God showed Ezekiel in a vision the valley of dry bones, and how he brought the bones together and fit the right ones in the right body and made them real people and not Frankenstein monsters. You can imagine if there's the people who in a dinosaur field have a hard time putting the right bone with the right dinosaur. God didn't have that problem. And he can take old curmudgeons and make them into loving, kind people. Those people who used to come and serve and worship can be changed into loving people, from dry bones to living servants of the Most High God. He did it with the people of Judah many times, and we're much like that in Albert County. People are people. Our part is not to give up on those old people who are our neighbors, and the younger ones who used to come to Sunday school, and all of those people, they learned about Jesus. And they need to come back. Well, today is our 40th wedding anniversary. We're 40 years married today. And we've decided to continue. And we will tomorrow and the next day, and until the Lord takes one of us home. We'll be married together. And that's the task of the bride of Christ, to continue and to remind those who used to come to return, to remind their families who still live close to come too. Come and try and find God in his mercy and let you fumble along and bless you for the efforts. As we remember, I read about Hezekiah, and he did it all wrong, and God blessed him, because God takes into account the fact that we're not going to get it right every time. But if we seek him, we will find him if we seek him with all our hearts.